In the grand halls of European royalty, power was measured in crowns, armies, and the divine right to rule. But behind the gilded mirrors and velvet curtains of Spain's royal palace, one man's greatest battle wasn't against rival empires, it was against his own mind. This is the story of Philip V of Spain, a king who ruled half the world but couldn't rule himself. Born in the shadow of Versailles, grandson to the legendary Sun King, Philip was destined to carry the Bourbon legacy across borders. Yet what history remembers isn't the wars he fought or the treaties he signed, but the madness that consumed him, the love that imprisoned two queens, and the eerie silence that lingered through his palace for 40 years. Imagine a ruler so fragile he couldn't bear a single hour away from his wife, who ordered his queen to sit beside him as he ate, slept, and governed. Imagine a monarch so lost in grief he spent days speaking to a corpse, convinced she might answer back. For nearly half a century, Spain was ruled by a ghost, a man trapped in rituals of devotion, fear, and decay. His story is not one of conquest, but of captivity, a royal descent into obsession that blurred the line between power and madness. Tonight, we open the doors of the Buen Retiro Palace and step into the haunted mind of Europe's most tormented king, Philip V of Spain. Versailles, the beating heart of France, where sunlight bends through crystal chandeliers and every gesture carries the weight of history. Here, in 1683, amid a blur of silk and incense, a frail infant cried his first breath, Philip of Bourbon, grandson to Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. From the moment he opened his eyes, the boy was surrounded by perfection, mirrors, music, and the mechanical grace of a court that worshipped control. Yet behind the gold, something in him was hollow. Tutors would later recall that the young Philip seldom spoke. He could spend entire afternoons motionless, staring at nothing, as if his mind lived somewhere the rest of them could not reach. When his cousins played war games across the marble courtyard, he'd sit apart, tracing invisible patterns on his sleeves. Servants whispered the boy was melancholic, a fashionable word for an unfashionable mystery. Versailles demanded performance, smiles for courtiers, bows for dukes, clever words for the king. But Philip's world was soundless, closed off like a sealed room. The only voice that truly reached him belonged to his mother, Marie Anne of Bavaria. She became his anchor, his orbit. Wherever she went, he followed, quiet, pale, shadow-thin. If separated for even an hour, he trembled, cried, sometimes collapsed in uncontrollable fits. In a palace built for spectacle, this raw dependence unsettled everyone. When Philip turned 14, the inevitable struck. Marie Anne fell ill and died suddenly. Witnesses said the boy didn't cry. He simply stood beside her bed for nearly a full day, unmoving, unspeaking, as though sheer will could command her heart to beat again. Only when servants forced him away did he collapse, whispering her name into the sheets. For weeks afterward, he refused food, refused daylight. Versailles continued its endless masquerade of power, balls, audiences, gossip, but inside his locked chamber, the young Bourbon had vanished into the abyss that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Psychologists today might call it a catastrophic attachment rupture. In the 17th century, they called it melancholy, a curse, a temperament, a shadow of the soul. Whatever the term, something inside Philip broke that winter, and it never truly healed. Fate, however, had a dark sense of irony. Philip was never meant to rule. He was the second son, destined for a comfortable life behind his elder brother's brilliance. But dynasties have a habit of turning tragedy into opportunity. In Spain, the once mighty Habsburg line was collapsing under its own blood. King Charles II, the last of them, was dying childless, his body a living map of centuries of inbreeding. As Europe held its breath, diplomats and priests circled like vultures. When Charles finally expired in 1700, his will shocked the continent. He left the entire Spanish Empire, from the Americas to the Philippines, to the 17-year-old Philip of Anjou. Suddenly, the silent boy from Versailles was heir to half the known world. Louis XIV understood both the prize and the risk. Spain's riches could make France unstoppable, but his grandson's fragile mind could also undo it all. So the Sun King staged a careful performance. He dressed Philip in Spanish silks, surrounded him with Castilian advisors, and drilled him in the gestures of sovereignty. "Be a good Spaniard," the old monarch warned, "but remember, you were born a Frenchman." A paradox sealed inside a blessing. For the rest of his life, Philip would fail at both. In the winter of 1701, the new king began his journey south. What should have been a triumphant procession felt more like a funeral march. Witnesses along the route saw a boy king pale as wax, clutching his rosary, eyes darting at every noise. He wept openly, not for joy, but for fear. At every stop, he begged to turn back. His attendants coaxed him forward, promising rest at the next village. By the time the convoy reached the Spanish frontier, Philip's hands shook so violently he could barely sign his own name. This was the monarch Spain had been waiting for, a trembling teenager haunted by ghosts. February 1701. Madrid's nobility gathered beneath towering tapestries, eager to greet the new ruler who would restore their nation's grandeur. But the young king who entered the hall was not the savior they imagined. Thin, pale, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, Philip barely spoke during the coronation. Each time someone addressed him, he looked toward his advisors for cues, then repeated their words like an echo. When courtiers shouted "Viva el Rey," he flinched at the noise. One diplomat wrote, "Spain expected a lion and received a frightened boy." Still, the crown descended upon his trembling head. Trumpets blared, cannons thundered, and for a brief moment, the illusion held. But within days, the pattern reemerged: isolation, panic, dependence. The palace whispered that their new monarch could not eat or sleep alone. The early months of his reign were chaos disguised as ceremony. Ministers debated in whispers while Philip sat silently beside them, nodding without comprehension. Letters from Paris painted a grim picture. The King of Spain suffers from great weakness of the nerves. He dreads being left alone for even a moment. Louis XIV, alarmed, sent new envoys, doctors, confessors, anyone who might steady the fragile monarch. None succeeded. The boy who once needed his mother now needed a replacement. And the French court, ever pragmatic, already had someone in mind. Somewhere in the Duchy of Savoy, a young princess practiced her courtly bow, unaware that her fate was already sealed. Her name was Maria Luisa Gabriella of Savoy. Barely 13, bright, and diplomatic beyond her years, she would soon become the Queen of Spain, and the emotional lifeline of a king spiraling toward obsession. But that belongs to the next chapter. For now, Philip V sat alone in his grand chambers, a monarch wrapped in silk and fear, staring into the polished mirrors of Madrid's palace. In those reflections, he saw not the ruler of an empire, but the same lost boy from Versailles, still searching for the mother who never came back. The stage was set: a vast empire, a broken mind, and a marriage arranged not for love, but for survival. Spain had gained a king, but lost a leader. And the young girl who was about to enter his life had no idea she was walking into a gilded cage, where love, duty, and madness would become indistinguishable. She was only 13 when history chose her. Maria Luisa Gabriella of Savoy, the bright, diplomatic daughter of the Duke of Savoy, grew up in the cool shadow of the Alps, learning courtly manners and politics from tutors who whispered that intelligence could be more powerful than beauty. Yet nothing could have prepared her for what awaited beyond the Pyrenees: a broken empire, and a husband she would never truly escape. When she arrived in Madrid in the autumn of 1701, the people gathered by the thousands to see their new queen. The city pulsed with cautious hope. Spain had suffered through the grotesque decline of the Habsburg dynasty, madness, deformity, and decay. Now, with the young Bourbon king and his radiant bride, they dreamed of rebirth. Trumpets blared, church bells rang for hours, and fireworks lit the night sky. To the people, it was a symbol of renewal. To Maria Luisa, it was the closing of a door. From the moment she met King Philip V, she understood something was deeply wrong. He stood before her, tall, pale, eyes darting like a frightened animal, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, hesitant, almost childlike. He didn't ask about her journey or her family. He simply said, "Don't leave me." At first, she thought it was nerves, a new king overwhelmed by his duties. But by the wedding night, the truth emerged: Philip's need for her was absolute, consuming, and terrifying. He refused to let her out of his sight, not for meals, not for prayer, not even for sleep. Court protocol dictated that the king and queen should have separate apartments, as tradition demanded, but within days, Philip had Maria Louisa moved into his own chambers. When he ate, she sat beside him. When he read reports, she listened in silence. When he met with ministers, she was there, her face calm while his eyes flicked constantly toward her, making sure she was real. And when he slept, she lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing, sometimes steady, sometimes breaking into gasps or whispered fragments of prayer. The courtiers soon learned that the queen's presence was no longer optional, it was a requirement for governance itself. Ambassadors scheduled meetings around her health. Ministers stood waiting for hours outside the royal suite while Philip refused to emerge without her. Even when she was ill, he demanded she be carried into his study, pale and trembling, just so he could feel her near him. At night, servants would hear the king through the walls, sometimes sobbing, sometimes muttering, sometimes pleading with invisible forces. "Don't go, please don't go," he whispered, while Maria Luisa's soft voice tried to calm him. She was his light in the dark, but a light that was slowly burning itself out. The young queen handled her public duties with extraordinary grace. She smiled at processions, met with foreign envoys, and earned the affection of the Spanish people. To them, she was kind, elegant, and patient, the perfect queen. But those closest to her saw the toll it took. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. Her skin grew pale, her eyes dimmed from sleepless nights. The French court received reports describing her as an angel chained to a madman. Louis XIV's advisors urged the Spanish ministers to intervene, but no one dared. In a world where divine right placed kings above judgment, the only solution was to manage the symptoms, not the cause. Maria Luisa endured, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of duty, or perhaps because she knew that without her, Philip would crumble completely. Over time, she learned to navigate his moods, gentle reassurance in the morning, quiet obedience in the afternoon, and endless patience through the long, haunted nights. Between 1707 and 1714, she bore 4 sons who survived infancy: Louis, Philip, Ferdinand, and Charles. Her pregnancies brought brief moments of hope to the court, but even during labor, the king refused to leave her side. He paced the chamber, sweating, muttering prayers, occasionally shouting at the doctors. When she screamed from pain, he flinched as though struck himself. After each birth, rather than allowing her to rest, he demanded she return to his side within days, unable to function without her presence. The queen's body began to falter. Her youth withered under the strain. By 17, she looked 30. By 20, her hair had lost its luster, and her once bright eyes carried the dull sheen of exhaustion. She suffered frequent fevers, fainting spells, and chest pains, but she never complained. The palace physicians prescribed tonics, prayers, and rest. But rest was impossible when your husband feared silence. Diplomats tried to disguise the growing disaster. Official portraits showed a serene royal couple, hands joined in devotion. But behind the canvas was despair. The Spanish court, already suffocating under the weight of formality, now revolved entirely around one man's psychological fragility. The state suffered. Military reports went unread. Financial reform stalled. Ambassadors returned home describing Spain as the nation ruled by the heartbeat of a frightened king. Louis XIV in France, realizing the danger, sent a stream of envoys, confessors, and physicians. None could separate the pair, and each attempt to do so provoked hysteria. Philip would shout, sob, or even collapse when Maria Luisa was taken from him. "She is my soul," he said, "and I will die if she leaves." In public, the queen maintained her composure. In private, she prayed for strength. Some nights, she wrote letters to her family in Savoy, describing her life as a performance that never ends. She thanked God for her children but admitted she no longer recognized herself. "I live," she wrote, "only because someone else cannot live without me." In early 1714, her health failed entirely. After a miscarriage, infection set in. The official record lists the cause as an abscess, but those who saw her in her final days believed she simply collapsed from exhaustion, her heart and body consumed by 13 years of relentless strain. As she lay dying, Philip refused to leave the bedside. Witnesses described a scene almost too painful to imagine, the king kneeling beside her, gripping her hand, begging her to stay, tears streaming down his face. "If you go," he whispered, "I will follow." When her breathing slowed, he pressed his ear to her chest as though listening for one last heartbeat. When it stopped, he began to laugh, a thin, broken laugh that slid into sobbing. For 3 days, Philip refused to let anyone touch her body. He sat beside the corpse, holding her cold hand, speaking to her in soft tones. Servants who entered the chamber described him smiling at her as if she were alive, answering his own questions in a falsetto imitation of her voice. The stench of decay filled the room before guards finally carried him away, screaming that they were killing her again. Spain had lost its queen. But more than that, the country had lost its last fragile link to stability. Ministers described the king as the man living among ghosts. He would not eat, would not bathe, would not speak coherently. The curtains of the palace were drawn closed, the halls silent except for the sound of his cries. The story of Maria Luisa of Savoy is not simply a tragedy of love, it is a tragedy of duty. A young girl, chosen to hold together an empire through her husband's madness, consumed by that very task. She was not just a queen, she was a lifeline. And in giving herself completely to the needs of a broken king, she lost the only thing she ever owned, her own life. When Philip finally emerged months later, gaunt and trembling, he carried only one certainty: he could not exist alone. And so the search began, not for a partner, but for a replacement. Spain was silent after the death of Queen Maria Luisa. The bells of Madrid tolled for days, but inside the palace the silence felt heavier than mourning. It was the silence of a nation without a heartbeat. Behind the drawn curtains, the king had stopped functioning. Philip V refused food, refused sleep, refused reality. For weeks he lay on the floor of his bedchamber, clutching his late wife's rosary, muttering her name in the dark. The courtiers tiptoed past his door like priests in a tomb. Diplomats sent frantic reports to Paris: the King of Spain has lost all reason. He cannot be spoken to. Spain was still at war. The empire stretched from the New World to Naples, but its ruler could not rise from his knees. Ministers begged Louis XIV of France for guidance. The Sun King's reply was practical and cold: find him another wife. And so began one of the strangest royal searches in European history, not for a queen to share a throne, but for a woman strong enough to share a madness. In the summer of 1714, royal envoys scoured the courts of Italy. They needed someone young enough to bear heirs, yet mature enough to survive a husband who could barely endure separation for an hour. Most refused immediately, some laughed in disbelief. But one name kept returning in their letters: Elizabeth Farnese, the 22-year-old niece of the Duke of Parma. Elizabeth was no naive girl. She had been raised in the rough political climate of the Italian duchies, where intrigue was as common as prayer. She spoke several languages, managed her own correspondence, and, unlike the soft courtiers of Madrid, had the temperament of iron wrapped in silk. When she learned that Spain's widowed king was searching for a queen, she asked a single question: who truly governs, the king or the one beside him? Her advisors hesitated, but she already knew the answer. The marriage was arranged with stunning speed. In December 1714, barely 6 months after Maria Luisa's death, Elizabeth Farnese boarded her carriage for Spain. The journey over the Pyrenees was long and cold. When Elizabeth finally reached Madrid, she expected to meet a grieving widower. What she found instead was a ghost. Philip emerged to greet her wearing black robes, his beard unkempt, his skin gray from months without sunlight. His hand shook as he offered her a gift, a small chest filled with jewelry and gowns. "These belong to my beloved Maria Luisa," he said softly. "You will wear them. You will fix your hair as she did. You will live as she lived." Elizabeth understood instantly. This was not a marriage, it was an inheritance of identity. Her predecessor's spirit still ruled the palace, and she had just been asked to impersonate it. Most queens would have recoiled. Elizabeth did not. She looked at the trembling king and said, "As your majesty wishes." That night, she ordered Maria Louisa's gowns altered to fit her body and appeared before Philip the next morning dressed in the dead queen's colors. The court gasped, but the king smiled for the first time in months. Elizabeth quickly realized that compliance was the key to power. Philip needed her near him at all times, just as he had needed Maria Louisa. But unlike her gentle predecessor, Elizabeth was neither submissive nor sentimental. She treated his dependence as a lever. When he refused to eat, she fed him. When he trembled with paranoia, she held his hand and whispered prayers until he calmed. And once he was calm, she guided his pen across royal decrees she herself had drafted. Within months, Spain began to function again, not because the king had recovered, but because his new queen had learned to translate his weakness into authority. Ministers quickly understood that to reach the monarch, they first had to pass through her. Elizabeth's influence grew quietly but decisively. She replaced old advisors with loyal Italians, restored financial discipline, and pushed for new colonial policies. Behind every royal seal stood her steady hand. The courtiers nicknamed her La Parmigiana, the woman from Parma. What they meant as mockery became a badge of fear. Despite the outward stability, life inside the palace remained a waking nightmare. Philip's obsession never softened. He followed Elizabeth everywhere, during meals, prayers, even while she dressed. She learned to move gracefully under the constant weight of his stare. Each evening, he demanded she sleep beside him, her hand resting on his chest so he could feel her heartbeat. If she stirred in the night, he woke instantly, clutching her in panic. Servants reported that he sometimes whispered to her using Maria Louisa's name, and she pretended not to notice. 7 times she became pregnant. Each pregnancy brought the same pattern of devotion and dread: Philip's tears, his pacing outside the chamber, his desperate prayers. After each birth, she was summoned back to his side within days, her body barely healed. In letters to her brother in Parma, Elizabeth confessed, "I feel as if I am drowning beside a man who fears water. I must breathe for us both." But she did more than breathe. She ruled. As the years passed, Philip's condition worsened. His anxieties hardened into delusions. He became convinced that remaining king was a sin, that God demanded his abdication. In January 1724, to everyone's astonishment, he surrendered the crown to his 17-year-old son, Louis I, and retreated with Elizabeth to the palace of La Granja. For the first time in decades, Spain had a monarch capable of independent thought. But fate, ever cruel to the Bourbons, intervened again. 7 months later, Louis died of smallpox. When the news reached La Granja, Philip's reaction was unsettlingly serene. "God returns what is his," he murmured. Within weeks, he reclaimed the throne, as if the abdication had been nothing more than an intermission in his divine performance. Elizabeth said nothing. She simply dressed him again in royal robes and resumed her invisible command. By the 1730s, Philip no longer resembled a monarch at all. He dressed in coarse brown robes, refused to bathe, and slept during the day. At night he wandered the corridors, muttering hymns, convinced that demons followed him. Servants learned to vanish into side halls as he passed. Elizabeth endured it all: the filth, the odor, the endless prayers. She had become part caretaker, part warden, part prime minister. Every decree, every treaty, every appointment bore her hidden signature. Spain's foreign ambassadors learned that a nod from the Queen carried more weight than a dozen words from the King. She maintained a facade of devotion, even as her husband descended further into darkness. "He believes himself already dead," she confided once to a chaplain. "My task is to make the corpse rule." It was not cruelty, it was survival, for her, for their children, and for the nation that could not afford another collapse. In 1737, the court brought the famous castrato singer Farinelli from Italy to soothe the king's nightly torment. Every evening, the singer performed 4 arias chosen by Elizabeth. Under the soft candlelight, Philip would sit motionless as Farinelli's voice filled the hall, pure, unearthly, almost divine. Tears streamed down the king's face as the music wrapped around him like prayer. For those few minutes each night, peace returned. Then silence, and the cycle resumed. Even in this fragile calm, Elizabeth continued to govern. She arranged marriages for their sons, strengthened Spain's influence in Italy, and navigated Europe's dangerous politics with quiet precision. The empire functioned, not brilliantly, but reliably, because one woman refused to let it die. By the time Philip reached his 60s, he was a hollow figure. His skin was sallow, his teeth rotted, and his hands trembled so badly that his signature had to be forged. Yet his reign, or rather, Elizabeth's reign through him, remained one of the longest in Spanish history. Visitors described Madrid as a haunted court, dim corridors, perfumed air to mask decay, and a king who mumbled prayers behind closed doors while his queen issued orders in his name. When Philip finally died in 1746, Elizabeth did not weep in public. She stood beside his body with the composure of someone who had already spent 30 years preparing for that moment. He was 62. She was 52, still standing, still unbroken. In her private letters she would later write, "I spent 3 decades in captivity. Now the door has opened, and I no longer fear death, for I have lived with it." Spain had survived, but at a terrible price. 2 queens had kept one man's madness from consuming an empire. One had perished from love, the other had ruled through endurance. Together they proved that behind every crown lies a secret cost, a price history rarely counts when it measures the weight of kings. The winter of 1724 had marked its first collapse. By the 1740s, the walls of the Spanish palace themselves seemed to breathe with it. Every hallway smelled faintly of wax, perfume, and despair. The courtiers still bowed, the bells still rang, the empire still existed on parchment, but its king had long since withdrawn into another world. Philip V of Spain, once the timid boy from Versailles, now drifted through the palace like a shadow wearing a crown. His reign had lasted 4.5 decades, interrupted only by a few brief months of abdication, but time had turned it into a theater of ghosts. He no longer followed the sun. Philip slept through the mornings, rose at dusk, and wandered the palace halls until dawn. Servants carrying lanterns trailed behind him, their light glimmering on marble floors slick with condensation. He muttered prayers in Latin, stopping to scratch invisible marks on the walls. Sometimes he sang half-remembered hymns, fragments of childhood lullabies. Witnesses described him as neither living nor dead. His beard had gone gray and wild, his nails long and yellow. He wore the same brown monk's robe day after day, refusing to bathe because he was convinced that water would make him ill. The odor that followed him became legend. Courtiers learned to mask it with handfuls of herbs tucked into their sleeves. When the servants dared to open the curtains, he screamed for darkness. "Light burns me," he cried, collapsing onto the floor. Even sunlight had become an enemy. By now, Queen Elizabeth Farnese was more caretaker than consort. She followed him from chamber to chapel, from the throne room to the confessional. Each time he stopped, she stopped. Each time he raved, she listened. Her strength was astonishing. To the outside world she appeared serene, her posture perfect, her gowns immaculate, but in private letters she confessed to a fatigue beyond measure. "I feel," she wrote to her brother, "as though I am chained to a corpse that still breathes." Still, she would not abandon him. Her power depended on his crown, and his crown existed only because she willed it to remain upon his head. Ministers brought her documents at midnight. She read them by candlelight while Philip whispered psalms beside her, rocking back and forth like a child. When they needed the king's signature, she guided his trembling hand, tracing the letters of his name for him. To everyone at court, it was clear, Spain was ruled by a ghost and a woman strong enough to pretend otherwise. The king's mind had become a storm. He claimed to hear voices, saints, angels, sometimes the devil himself. He would fall to his knees, shouting orders no one could understand. At other times he was seized by morbid conviction that his body was rotting. One week he insisted worms were eating him from the inside. The next, he believed his skin was turning to dust. Physicians tried everything: bleeding, herbs, even electric shocks from early static machines. Nothing worked. At his worst, he ordered the chapel sealed, demanding private mass after private mass at impossible hours. Priests grew hoarse reciting prayers through the night. Some fled the palace in terror. And through it all, Elizabeth remained. If he breaks, she told her confessor, Spain breaks with him. Then came Farinelli. The Italian castrato singer arrived in 1737, summoned as a last hope. His voice was already famous across Europe, a voice said to calm storms and move armies to tears. On his first night in Madrid, the singer entered the candlelit chamber where the king sat hunched, rocking silently. Elizabeth motioned him to begin. Farinelli sang 4 arias. The music filled the darkness, pure, otherworldly, shimmering with melancholy. For the first time in years, Philip stopped moving. His hands dropped to his knees. Tears welled in his eyes. When the final note faded, he whispered, "It is the voice of an angel." From that night onward, the ritual never changed. Each evening, Farinelli sang the same 4 songs. The king sat motionless, eyes closed, as though the melodies tethered him to reality. Elizabeth ensured the schedule was never broken. Even during war councils or royal births, the music continued. For nearly 2 decades, those songs became Spain's unofficial anthem of survival, a lullaby for a nation ruled by madness. While the king listened to music and ghosts, Elizabeth Farnese governed. She negotiated marriages that placed her sons on Italian thrones, expanded trade in the Americas, and maintained a fragile neutrality in Europe's endless wars. Her rule was practical, sometimes ruthless, but it kept the empire intact. Ambassadors learned the rhythm of the palace, approach the queen during daylight, avoid the king after dark, and never, ever speak of his illness. Outside the palace gates, Spain endured droughts, inflation, and the slow decay of colonial power. Yet the bureaucracy moved with mechanical precision, proof that Elizabeth's quiet authority had become stronger than any royal decree. She was the mind, he was the signature. Still, the pretense carried a cost. Rumors spread of a cursed monarch and a queen who used witchcraft to control him. Superstitious courtiers whispered that Farinelli's songs were not mere music but exorcisms. Inside the palace, the queen ignored the gossip. "Let them speak," she told her secretary. "As long as Spain obeys." By 1744, the king's body was failing as quickly as his mind. Painful ulcers covered his legs, his teeth decayed until he could eat only broth. He refused all medical help, insisting that God would decide when his suffering should end. At night, he spoke to invisible guests, his mother, Maria Luisa, long-dead ministers. "They wait for me," he said. Elizabeth knelt beside him, praying aloud so that the living voices might drown out the dead. He became convinced that he was already dead and demanded funerary masses for himself. When priests hesitated, he threatened to excommunicate them. They obeyed, terrified. Through it all, the queen remained outwardly composed. Her courtiers called her the Iron Widow before widowhood. In July 1746, after weeks of fever and delirium, Philip V finally stopped speaking. His breathing slowed, his hands twitched, then grew still. Elizabeth sat beside him until the final exhale. He was 62, Spain's first Bourbon king, and perhaps its most tormented. His reign had lasted 45 years, longer than most dynasties endure. Yet when he died, the courtiers who had served him wept not just from grief but from relief. The long night was over. Madrid awoke to a new dawn. His son, Ferdinand VI, ascended the throne, a rational, measured ruler determined to cleanse the palace of its ghosts. One of his first decrees ordered Philip's apartment scrubbed and repainted, the curtains thrown open, the windows unsealed. "Let there be light in the house of the king," he said. Elizabeth Farnese retired to the Palace of La Granja, surrounded by her children and a mountain of correspondence. Freed at last, she seemed to age backward. Visitors described her as animated, almost cheerful, a woman rediscovering the sound of her own laughter. She lived another 20 years, working tirelessly to secure Italian crowns for her sons. In private, she never spoke of her husband's madness. Only in a single surviving letter did she allow the truth to slip through. For 30 years, she wrote, "I lived beside the abyss. I learned to smile so that Spain would not see." When she died in 1766, she was remembered not as a queen of passion but of endurance, the woman who kept the empire alive while its king drifted in darkness. Historians would later argue about Philip's illness. Some called it depression, others schizophrenia, others the result of generations of royal inbreeding. But diagnosis could not capture what his reign truly revealed: the cost of monarchy when humanity is sacrificed to ritual. Behind the grandeur of crowns and cathedrals, there was always a heartbeat trembling with fear. The story of Philip V was not the story of a tyrant or a fool. It was the story of a man who wanted love, found obsession, and turned an empire into a mirror of his own despair. When visitors today walk through the quiet halls of El Buen Retiro or La Granja, they still speak of a presence, a whisper of hymns in the distance, the echo of footsteps that stop when you listen. Perhaps it is only memory. Or perhaps, as the legend goes, the king who feared daylight still wanders those corridors, waiting for the music to begin again. The summer of 1746 brought peace to Spain for the first time in nearly half a century, but it was not the peace of triumph. It was the stillness that follows a storm too long endured. King Philip V was dead, and with him ended one of the most tragic reigns in European history. The courtiers who had spent their lives walking on eggshells around a mad monarch now exhaled for the first time in years. Yet the silence that filled the palace was not simple relief. It was something heavier, the quiet left behind when fear has become habit. Philip's body lay in the Buen Retiro Palace, surrounded by candles and priests murmuring prayers for his soul. Few dared to approach the coffin. Even in death, the memory of his madness frightened them. Servants whispered that the king's spirit had not yet left the palace, that his shadow still wandered the corridors searching for the queen he had lost. But the truth was more human and more haunting. Spain had been ruled for 45 years by a man who could not rule, and by two women who had to carry the weight of his crown, his grief, and his disease. History would record his reign in treaties and wars, but the real story, the one whispered behind curtains, was written in the suffering of those closest to him. When Ferdinand VI, Philip's son, took the throne, he inherited not only an empire but a haunted legacy. His first act as king was to banish darkness from the royal residence. Curtains were thrown open, floors scrubbed, furniture burned. "Let the air be new again," he ordered. The smell of incense, candle wax, and decay gave way to sunlight for the first time in decades. Ferdinand was determined to break with his father's ghost. He ruled with quiet discipline, avoiding the extravagance of Versailles and the chaos of his father's court. But those who knew him privately saw the shadows lingering. He had grown up in fear, a childhood spent watching his mother weep, his father unravel, and his world collapse behind locked doors. The trauma left its mark. Ferdinand became cautious to the point of paralysis, a man terrified of emotion, of excess, of losing control. He once confided to a priest, "I do not wish to be loved like my father was loved." His love destroyed everything it touched. It was a sentence that summed up an entire dynasty's curse. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth Farnese, freed at last from her long captivity beside a broken man, returned to her estate at La Granja de San Ildefonso. She was 52, but her spirit was sharper than ever. Visitors found her surrounded by letters, maps, and reports, still governing, still scheming, as if unable to stop. In the quiet of her private chambers, she would sit by the window overlooking the gardens she had designed decades earlier, watching the wind move through the fountains. To some she seemed serene, to others, haunted. "She has survived her husband," one ambassador wrote, "but she lives as if she still hears him whispering prayers in the next room." For the rest of her life, Elizabeth dedicated herself to securing thrones for her sons. She negotiated, threatened, and bribed her way through the courts of Europe, ensuring that the House of Bourbon-Parma would survive where her husband's mind had failed. Her letters reveal a woman hardened by endurance but never defeated by it. "I spent 30 years pretending," she wrote to one of her sons. "Now, I am finally myself, though I no longer know who that is." When she died in 1766, she was buried beside Philip, the man who had consumed her youth and shaped her destiny. Her tomb bears no inscription of love, only titles, years, and the emblem of Spain. Yet among the royal portraits that line the halls of Madrid, one face is often overlooked: Maria Luisa of Savoy, Philip's first wife. She died at 25, exhausted by devotion, erased by history. Her letters, few of which survive, show the tenderness and sorrow of a girl forced to become her husband's sanity. "He looks at me," she once wrote, "as if I am the only thing keeping him alive." And perhaps that is true. But I cannot carry another's soul without losing my own. Historians rarely dwell on her story, perhaps because it is too quiet, too domestic, too tragic to fit neatly into the chronicles of kings and wars. Yet without her, there might have been no dynasty at all. Her patience held Spain together during the most fragile years of Philip's rule. And her death marked the point from which his madness could no longer be contained. In truth, Maria Luisa was not just Philip's wife, she was the scaffolding that kept his world from collapsing. When she died, the structure fell, and Spain spent the next 3 decades living in its ruins. Modern historians have tried to diagnose Philip V. Some say he suffered from bipolar disorder, others from major depression, and still others from schizoaffective psychosis. But the labels, though useful, fail to capture the deeper tragedy, a man trapped in a system that would not allow him to be human. In the 18th century, kings were gods in miniature, untouchable, unquestionable, isolated in divine power. But what happens when a god goes mad? When the figure at the center of the empire can no longer tell night from day, prayer from delusion, devotion from disease? The answer was found in the women around him. 2 queens became his prison guards, his caretakers, his lifelines. The court physicians could bleed his body, but it was their love and endurance that kept Spain alive. Philip's reign revealed a truth the world still struggles to accept, that absolute power isolates, and isolation breeds madness. His mind was a mirror reflecting the system that created him, perfection without compassion, ritual without relief, a cage made of gold. The Bourbon dynasty continued, but not untouched. Philip's descendants would inherit not only his crown but his fragility. Generations of Spanish royals suffered from mental illness, melancholy, or hysteria, an echo of the same storm that had once consumed their ancestor. When King Charles III, Philip's grandson, later rebuilt Spain's empire, he ruled with reason and reform, but even he feared the return of the family sickness. In private, he kept portraits of Philip covered by cloth, as though to keep the ghosts from waking. Through all of it, one idea endured, the myth of divine monarchy, polished and preserved like a relic. But behind that myth was the truth, that the crown itself was cursed not by magic, but by memory. When you walk through the halls of El Escorial or La Granja today, the air feels heavy, not with grandeur, but with remembrance. The portraits stare down with the solemn stillness of people who lived too long in silence. It is said that on quiet nights, the caretakers hear faint music drifting through the corridors, a single voice singing 4 arias, the same ones Farinelli sang to soothe the king. The sound, they say, comes from nowhere and everywhere, carried on the wind. Some dismiss it as legend, others swear it is the echo of a man who could not find peace even in death. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Philip V's madness was not unique. It was human, magnified by power, hidden by ritual, and endured by those who loved him. His story is not only the tale of a king who lost his mind, but of a world that demanded he keep wearing the crown anyway. In the end, history remembers Philip V as Spain's first Bourbon monarch, the man who rebuilt the empire after the War of Succession. But behind that title lies the shadow of a frightened boy from Versailles, a husband clinging to his wife's hand in the dark, and a ruler who could not separate devotion from despair. 2 queens, 2 prisons, 1 crown. That was the true legacy of Philip V, not his power, not his reforms, but the quiet devastation of those forced to live within his madness. And perhaps that is the real lesson of his reign, that the cost of ruling half the world is often paid not in gold or blood, but in the human soul. The story of Philip V of Spain does not end with his death in 1746. In many ways, that was only the beginning of his afterlife, not in heaven or hell, but in history's uneasy conscience. His reign had been long, chaotic, and unforgettable, yet deeply misunderstood. He was remembered as the first Bourbon king of Spain, the monarch who rebuilt an empire, modernized administration, and survived endless wars. But behind the statistics and the polished portraits lay a very different truth, the story of a man who was both ruler and prisoner, king and captive, hero and ghost. It began, as all tragedies do, with innocence. A boy born into privilege but destined for despair. Raised under the blinding perfection of Versailles, young Philip was never taught to be human, only to be royal. His tutors polished his manners, not his mind. His family praised obedience, not curiosity. The result was a child who could imitate majesty but not inhabit it. He learned early that emotions were dangerous, that love was duty, and that silence was safer than honesty. The seeds of madness were not inherited from his ancestors alone, they were cultivated by the very institution meant to protect him. When fate made him King of Spain at 17, the stage was already set. The world saw a crowned prince stepping into greatness. In truth, a frightened boy was stepping into an empire too heavy for his soul. He sought comfort in his first wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, and found in her the mother he had lost. Their love was real, but it was poisoned by his dependence. Every heartbeat of affection was shadowed by fear, the fear of losing her, of being left alone again. When she died, that fear became prophecy, and the prophecy became madness. Power isolates. It isolates more completely than walls, wealth, or pride. For Philip, the isolation was not physical, it was emotional. Surrounded by servants, courtiers, priests, and flatterers, he was never truly seen. His every gesture was observed, interpreted, praised, or feared. He could not grieve without scandal, could not love without condition, could not even fall ill without turning his sickness into a state crisis. So he withdrew, first from politics, then from people, then from reality itself. The boy who once whispered prayers at Versailles became the man who wandered through darkened corridors in Madrid, afraid of sunlight, afraid of his own reflection. When he closed the curtains of the royal palace, he wasn't merely shunning light. He was closing the door on the world that demanded perfection from a mind that could no longer bear it. Spain's survival during Philip's reign was not the triumph of monarchy, it was the endurance of women. Maria Louisa of Savoy and Elizabeth Farnese were not queens in the ceremonial sense, they were the spine of the state. Maria Louisa bore the unbearable, living day and night in the suffocating orbit of her husband's obsession. She became his voice, his nurse, his sanity. When she died at 25, Spain lost not just a queen but its tether to stability. Then came Elizabeth, harder, sharper, forged by experience. Where Maria Louisa had been tender, Elizabeth was strategic. She turned her husband's illness into armor. She used his dependency as her instrument of rule, not for cruelty but for survival. The Spain that endured through decades of madness, the Spain that continued to function, to fight wars, to sign treaties, existed because of her ruthless compassion. Yet both women paid the same price, their humanity. To save a kingdom, they had to destroy themselves. Maria Louisa through exhaustion. Elizabeth through endurance. In the grand halls of Madrid, the monarchy became performance art. Ministers acted, courtiers pretended, and the king became both actor and illusion. Philip signed decrees he didn't understand. He blessed soldiers he would never command. He wore crowns that meant nothing to him anymore. The real Spain, its government, its diplomacy, its reforms, ran quietly in the background under the guidance of others. The fiction of monarchy continued because it had to. To admit the king was insane would be to admit the divine system was flawed. And so the empire learned to function in denial, a lesson that outlived Philip himself. It's tempting to view his reign as an anomaly, a tragic footnote in a glorious dynasty. But it wasn't. It was a mirror. It revealed the flaw that lay at the heart of every absolute monarchy, the belief that a man can carry the weight of millions without breaking. And yet, amid the despair, there was beauty. In 1737, when the Italian castrato singer Farinelli arrived at the Spanish court, his voice became a balm not only for the king's mind but for a nation's soul. Each night, under flickering candlelight, he sang the same 4 arias, gentle, mournful, ethereal. For those few minutes, Philip's eyes would soften, his hands would stop shaking, and the court would breathe again. The sound became Spain's heartbeat. Outside the palace walls, the people fought hunger and taxes, but inside, a single human voice was holding together the illusion of divine order. Music did what politics could not, it gave a mad king peace. It is perhaps the most poetic image of Philip's reign, a monarch lost in darkness, rescued each night by a song. When Philip's son Ferdinand VI ascended the throne, he carried not only the royal bloodline but the invisible scars of his father's madness. His reign was calm, disciplined, almost sterile, a deliberate overcorrection for decades of chaos. He avoided extravagance, distrusted passion, and clung to routine as if it were salvation. But even he could not escape the shadow. In later years, Ferdinand too descended into melancholy after his beloved wife's death, retreating into solitude until his own mind began to crumble. The cycle had repeated. The Bourbon dynasty had inherited more than power. It had inherited fragility, a genetic, emotional, and spiritual inheritance of fear. From Philip's trembling hands to Ferdinand's silence, to the later Bourbons who would face revolution and exile, the pattern was clear: the crown was a crown of thorns. Modern Spain remembers Philip V as both founder and warning. The dynasty he established would last for centuries, but his life exposed the cost of divine kingship in its rawest form. He showed that authority without empathy is not strength, it is rot. That love without balance becomes obsession. That faith without mercy turns into madness. Behind every empire's grandeur are the quiet casualties, the spouses, servants, and children who must orbit the powerful until they burn out. In Philip's story, the empire itself became one of those casualties. His court, once magnificent, ended as a mausoleum of whispers and rituals. His palace, once a symbol of glory, became a sanitarium disguised as a throne room. And yet, perhaps there is something deeply human in that. Because Philip was not a monster. He was simply a man who broke beneath expectations no one could meet. His tragedy was not that he was mad, it was that he was never allowed to be anything else. Centuries later, visitors to La Granja still say they can feel the chill of his presence, not as a ghostly specter, but as an emotional residue, the kind that lingers in spaces where people suffered silently. Some claim that on certain nights, when the moonlight hits the palace just right, faint music can be heard drifting from the old royal chambers, the ghostly echo of Farinelli's song. Perhaps it is only legend. Or perhaps it is Spain remembering the man who once ruled it, not the king of conquests or treaties, but the king who lost himself in the name of duty. Philip V was the boy who became a ghost long before his death. The crown did not elevate him, it devoured him. And as history repeats itself in new forms, in politics, in fame, in power, his story remains a quiet warning across time that no empire, no dynasty, no leader can survive without the courage to be human. History has a way of simplifying monsters and sanctifying kings. Yet the truth of Philip V of Spain is far more fragile, far more human than the legends suggest. For nearly 3 centuries, his name has been wrapped in ceremony: the founder of Spain's Bourbon dynasty, the restorer of royal power, the king who rebuilt a weary empire. But behind the marble statues and grand portraits lies a story that history itself tried to bury, the story of a man whose crown became a curse, whose love became a prison, and whose mind unraveled beneath the crushing weight of divine expectation. To understand Philip's legacy, one must strip away the velvet and gold and look instead at what remained after the lights went out, a kingdom that survived not through its monarch's strength, but through the endurance of those forced to live in his shadow. When Philip died in 1746, Spain sighed with relief, not reverence. The courtiers who had endured his reign spoke of peace returning to the palace. Priests muttered prayers, servants burned the linens from his chambers, and the walls themselves seemed to exhale after decades of whispered madness. But for all their cleansing, one thing could not be erased: the deep psychological wound his rule had carved into Spain's collective consciousness. The fear of instability, the memory of a monarch who was both holy and horrifying, would shape Spanish politics for generations. Philip's court had been a theater, ornate, glittering, and full of fear. His servants learned the art of silence, his ministers mastered the skill of speaking without saying anything at all. The system endured by pretending its leader was sane. In the years after his death, that habit became a national reflex. Spain, humiliated by its decaying empire, learned to disguise weakness with ritual, just as its king once disguised madness with religion. Even as Enlightenment ideas swept through Europe, Spain clung to its solemn etiquette, its obsession with appearances, its fear of change. It was a kingdom traumatized by its own reflection. Every gesture of control, every act of loyalty, echoed the long nightmare of a monarch who could not control himself. The courtiers who had once bowed to Philip's delusions raised their sons to bow to tradition instead. And thus, a different kind of madness, quieter, institutional, and enduring, took root. In this theater of denial, two women were written out of the script. Maria Luisa of Savoy and Elizabeth Farnese had held Spain together through the sheer force of will, but official chronicles reduced them to footnotes. The court painters captured them as elegant ornaments, but their true strength, their suffering, never made it into the portraits. Maria Luisa, who had died at 25, became a symbol of saintly virtue. Her pain was romanticized, her exhaustion ignored. She was remembered as the angel of the palace, when in truth she had been its prisoner. The truth was too uncomfortable for history to bear, that a queen could die not of disease, but of love turned into burden. Elizabeth Farnese fared little better. She was remembered as cunning, ambitious, manipulative, the stereotype of the scheming woman behind the throne. Yet her ambition was survival. She ruled because she had to. She negotiated, plotted, and maneuvered not to feed her ego but to keep a collapsing monarchy alive. Her letters, discovered centuries later, reveal not malice but fatigue. Every day, she wrote, I wake to another battle I did not choose. Together, they embodied two sides of the same coin, one destroyed by tenderness, the other hardened by necessity. History gave them no glory, but Spain owed them its continuity. Philip's illness did not die with him. It seeped into his bloodline, resurfacing in subtle and terrible ways. His son Ferdinand VI governed with restraint bordering on obsession. His grandson Charles III masked anxiety behind relentless reform. Later Bourbons would show signs of melancholy, paranoia, and nervous collapse, symptoms that historians now recognize as hereditary echoes of Philip's own condition. But perhaps the most haunting legacy was psychological, not genetic. Spain's rulers inherited not just fragile minds, but fragile faith, a distrust of emotion, a fear of weakness, an instinct to rule through detachment. The result was a monarchy that appeared dignified but felt hollow. The Bourbon kings of the 18th and 19th centuries governed like men afraid of ghosts, and in a way, they were. For every revolution, every reform, every crisis that followed, Philip's shadow loomed in the background, whispering that madness and monarchy were inseparable. Centuries later, the story of Philip V still feels eerily modern. His struggle between duty and self, his mental decline under relentless public scrutiny, his inability to separate love from dependence, all mirror the tragedies of power that still play out today. Whether in politics, fame, or leadership, the same pattern repeats. Those at the top are often the loneliest, their humanity sacrificed to the illusion of strength. Philip's illness, misunderstood in his time, would today be recognized as a complex combination of bipolar disorder and obsessive-compulsive delusion. But 18th century medicine had no language for such things. Madness was sin, grief was weakness, obsession was devotion. In that world, a man could lose his mind and still be called holy, as long as he wore a crown. This is what makes his story timeless. It's not merely about one broken monarch, it's about the danger of dehumanizing power itself. The system that destroyed Philip still exists in other forms, in governments, corporations, even celebrity culture, wherever image outweighs truth, and silence becomes survival. Today, the royal palaces of Madrid and La Granja still stand, immaculate and luminous, visited by tourists who admire their chandeliers, their frescoes, their marble halls. But those walls remember more than they show. If one listens closely in the quiet corridors, it's easy to imagine the faint sound of footsteps pacing at midnight, the echo of whispered prayers, the soft sobbing of a woman who could not sleep because the king would not let her. These palaces are not monuments to glory. They are monuments to endurance, to the human cost of maintaining perfection. The golden ceilings gleam because someone once polished them by candlelight, terrified of doing it wrong. The portraits shine because they were painted over tears. Every empire leaves scars, and Spain's are painted in gold leaf. In the National Portrait Gallery in Madrid, one painting stands out. It shows Philip V in royal armor, his expression serene, his posture commanding. But when you look closer, his eyes betray him. They are not the eyes of a warrior or a visionary. They are tired, unfocused, the gaze of a man trapped in a role he cannot escape. For centuries, visitors admired that painting without noticing its quiet confession. Today, art historians speak of psychological realism, how painters sometimes revealed more truth than they intended. Perhaps the artist saw what courtiers could not say, that the King of Spain was already fading, even as he sat for the portrait. He had become what history would later call him, the most powerful ghost in Europe. In the end, Philip V's story is not just Spain's tragedy. It is a universal parable, a warning about the cost of confusing greatness with perfection, power with divinity, duty with love. His madness was not an exception to monarchy, it was its inevitable consequence. And yet, there is something profoundly moving in his failure. Beneath the robes and rituals, Philip was simply human, flawed, frightened, desperate to be loved. He lived in an era that denied him that right. Perhaps that is why his story still resonates. Because somewhere, in every generation, there are still people who carry the same burden, to appear strong when they are breaking, to perform sanity for a watching world, to wear a crown they never asked for. Philip's life was a tragedy. But his memory is a mirror. And when we look into it, we see not just the face of a mad king, but the reflection of our own fragile humanity. There comes a point in every story where history stops being about kings and starts being about people. The reign of Philip V of Spain, the boy king who became a prisoner of his own mind, is not simply the tale of one man's descent into madness. It is a reflection of a system, a mirror turned toward every society that has ever confused power with perfection and authority with divinity. His life was not an isolated tragedy, it was the symptom of something larger, something deeply human, the desire to worship strength, even when that strength is destroying itself. In the centuries that followed his death, Spain rebuilt, reformed, and reimagined itself countless times. Empires rose and fell. Thrones were challenged, restored, and abandoned. Yet through it all, the shadow of Philip's story remained, quiet but unshakable. His ghost lived not in the haunted halls of palaces, but in the hearts of those who understood the cost of survival under the illusion of perfection. After Philip's death in 1746, the Bourbon dynasty carried on as if nothing had happened. His successor, Ferdinand VI, imposed order and restraint, no grand displays of emotion, no public chaos, no visible cracks. On the surface, it worked. Spain stabilized, its administration strengthened, and Europe once again treated it as a serious power. But beneath that calm exterior lay something brittle, a quiet fear that too much feeling could destroy everything again. The court of Ferdinand became a palace of whispers. Ministers spoke in lowered voices, as though afraid that passion itself could summon madness back into the bloodline. Servants learned to move silently, priests to pray without fervor, and courtiers to smile without warmth. Spain had learned to live by suppression, a nation that feared not failure, but emotion. The monarchy had become a monument to control, built on the ruins of a man who had lost control completely. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of Philip's reign, the institutionalization of restraint. His madness taught Spain to hide its heart. Across Europe, the Enlightenment was blooming. Science, reason, and humanism were transforming monarchies into modern states. But Spain's progress remained haunted by its past. Every reform came with hesitation. Every attempt at openness collided with the fear of disorder. Philip's ghost whispered through the corridors of power, "Do not feel too much, do not risk too much, do not trust yourself too deeply." The very idea of kingship, once divine, began to fracture. No longer gods on earth, monarchs were now human beings expected to behave like machines. They had to be flawless, tireless, untouchable, or else risk collapsing the illusion of control. What happened to Philip V was not madness in isolation, it was the inevitable breaking of a man forced to live without weakness in a world that denied humanity. He was, in a way, the first modern casualty of image, the prototype of every public figure who smiles in front of the world while crumbling behind closed doors. His life foreshadowed a universal truth, that the performance of perfection is its own kind of madness. History, for all its grandeur, rarely makes room for the quiet heroes. But the real survivors of Philip's reign were his two wives, Maria Luisa of Savoy and Elizabeth Farnese, who lived, suffered, and endured what history could not yet name: emotional captivity. Maria Luisa's gentleness was both her strength and her doom. She became the heartbeat of a dying man, the only source of peace in his fractured mind. But her life was consumed by that devotion. She died young, drained of every ounce of self. Her tragedy is the tragedy of countless women throughout history, those expected to carry the weight of others' suffering without ever being seen as victims themselves. Elizabeth Farnese, on the other hand, refused to break. She ruled in his name, shaped policy, and wielded power in a court that viewed her as an intruder. But even she was not free, her strength was forged in chains. For 30 years she lived beside a man trapped between delusion and despair, playing the role of both queen and caretaker. Her endurance became Spain's stability, yet her pain became invisible. When the world praises Philip V for restoring Spain, it forgets that it was two women, one who loved him and one who managed him, who kept the crown from collapsing. In the depths of Philip's madness, there was one fragile thread connecting him to life: music. The Italian castrato Farinelli, whose voice became the king's nightly salvation, represents the most haunting symbol of all: the idea that art can reach the parts of the soul that reason cannot. For years, every evening without fail, Farinelli would sing 4 arias, the same ones, again and again. Outside the palace, Spain struggled with war, famine, and bureaucracy. Inside, a single voice kept the illusion of order alive. Those songs were more than entertainment, they were therapy before the world had words for it. In them, Philip found what he could not find in religion, politics, or power: mercy. It was a mercy born of beauty, fragile and fleeting, yet more powerful than any sermon. And in that, perhaps, lies the strangest grace of his story, that even the maddest of kings could be calmed by something as human as a song. Today, when historians speak of Philip V, they debate his reforms, his wars, his political alliances. But they rarely speak of his loneliness. They analyze his mental illness, but not his heartbreak. They calculate the costs of his reign but ignore the emotional arithmetic: the suffering of those who loved him, the silence of those who served him, the exhaustion of a nation that had to pretend everything was fine. And yet, in a strange way, we are closer to Philip now than ever. Our world, too, worships performance. We build thrones of our own, digital, corporate, political, and demand that those who sit on them be flawless. We mistake appearances for truth, devotion for strength, and silence for composure. Like Philip, we live in a theater of expectation, terrified that showing weakness will make us unworthy. His story, far from being ancient, feels like prophecy. A reminder that no one, not even kings, can survive being worshipped forever. The true lesson of Philip V's life is not found in royal decrees or wars of succession, but in the small human truths his reign revealed. That love, when bound by fear, becomes suffocation. That faith, when twisted by guilt, becomes madness. That duty, when stripped of compassion, becomes cruelty. Philip was never the villain of his own story, he was its victim. He lived in a world that could not forgive imperfection and could not imagine mercy. In that sense, his madness was not rebellion but surrender, the final act of a man crushed by the role he was forced to play. His story teaches us something that transcends centuries: that the measure of power is not how much control one holds, but how much humanity one keeps. If you walk through the gardens of La Granja today, you might hear the faint trickle of fountains and the rustle of wind through the cypress trees. It's peaceful, deceptively so. Yet beneath that calm, the place remembers. It remembers the king who built it to resemble Versailles but filled it with silence. It remembers the queen who wrote letters at midnight, trying to save a nation while soothing a madman. And perhaps, on certain quiet nights, it remembers the sound of Farinelli's song echoing through the marble halls, a melody of mercy for a soul that never found rest. In that echo lives the essence of Philip's story. Not the pomp of monarchy, but the pulse of humanity. Not the glory of empire, but the grief of endurance. His life reminds us that every throne is built on fragile hearts, and every crown carries a hidden weight, one that no human being was ever meant to bear alone. Philip V was called the most perverted king of Spain. But history, when told truthfully, reveals something else. He was not the most wicked, he was the most broken. And in his brokenness, he left behind the one lesson no crown could teach, that the greatest power in this world is not to rule, but to understand. In the end, every empire must face the same truth. It is not how it rises that defines it, but how it survives its own weight. For Spain, that truth was born in the reign of Philip V, a king who ruled half the world and yet could not rule himself. His name should have stood beside conquerors and visionaries, yet history remembers him as the monarch undone by his own mind. But what the world often forgets is that his madness did not destroy Spain, it reshaped it. It forced a kingdom, and an entire continent, to look at power in a new way, not as divine perfection, but as fragile humanity. When Philip died in 1746, the bells of Madrid tolled not in triumph, but in weary release. The courtiers whispered prayers of duty rather than sorrow. Spain's longest reigning monarch, 45 years of obsession, devotion, and decline, was gone, leaving behind a palace of ghosts and a nation that had learned to live within the illusion of order. For decades, ministers had learned to govern through him, priests had learned to bless him without believing, and the people had learned to endure him. His death was not an end, it was a breath. For the first time in half a century, Spain exhaled. When his son Ferdinand VI took the throne, he inherited not only a crown but the trauma of a nation raised under silence. He ruled with precision, calmness, and fear, as if too much feeling might wake the same demons that had consumed his father. Courtiers called him El Prudent, the prudent one, a man devoted to peace and order, to avoiding the chaos that had defined his youth. Yet when his beloved wife Barbara of Braganza died, Ferdinand too began to unravel. He retreated into isolation, barely eating or speaking, wandering the halls of his palace like a shadow, repeating, in softer tones, the same dissent his father had endured. The legacy of Philip's illness was not just genetic, it was spiritual. It had seeped into the blood of his children and into the architecture of power itself. The Spanish crown had become a symbol of endurance through quiet suffering. The Bourbons that followed, Charles III, Charles IV, Ferdinand VII, each carried a fragment of that wound. Charles III, a man of reason and reform, tried to rebuild Spain from the wreckage, introducing Enlightenment ideals and modern governance. But beneath his progress was an echo of melancholy, a desperate need for control that mirrored the compulsions of his grandfather. Charles IV, weaker and easily swayed, became a puppet to his wife Maria Luisa and her lover Godoy, repeating the same pattern of a king overshadowed by stronger wills. And Ferdinand VII, cruel and paranoid, ruled through fear, the final distortion of a dynasty that had learned to hide fragility behind iron. The madness had evolved, but it had never left. Yet something changed because of Philip. For the first time, Europe could no longer pretend that kings were divine. His illness made it impossible to deny that even the chosen of God were still flesh, still haunted by grief and weakness. Before him, madness was a moral failing. After him, it was a condition to be managed. Physicians began to replace priests in royal courts. Words like melancholy, hysteria, and mania began to enter the vocabulary of politics. Spain, without meaning to, had become the first kingdom to prove that power could survive its own human cracks. That realization, born in suffering, quietly shaped the future of monarchy. It forced rulers to build systems that could stand when men could not. The illusion of absolute kingship began to fade. In its place grew the beginnings of bureaucracy, councils, and constitutions. Philip's broken mind had unintentionally given birth to modern governance. Centuries later, his palace at La Granja still holds the weight of that transformation. At dawn, when mist rises over the fountains and marble statues, the gardens seem to breathe with the ghosts of that age. The statues of gods and heroes stare endlessly into the fog, their faces carved in serenity, yet their eyes hollow, as if even stone remembers the silence of a haunted king. Visitors speak of a strange feeling there, as though the air itself mourns. It is not the sorrow of defeat, but of endurance, the quiet ache of a nation that once lived in darkness and learned to move through it. Philip's story is not that of a tyrant, nor of a fool, but of a man trapped in an impossible role. He was a child who never recovered from loss, a ruler asked to be divine when he barely knew how to be alive. His sickness became a mirror, one that forced the world to see the truth behind the crown. He was not a monster, he was human. Too human for a system that demanded perfection. Today, psychologists would call him a man suffering from bipolar disorder, obsessive grief, and psychosis. Historians call him the father of modern Spain. But perhaps the truest title is this: the first king who showed the world what it means to be mortal. Because the lesson Philip left behind was not political, it was human. Power without compassion devours itself. Strength without mercy becomes cruelty. And when a system demands perfection from imperfect men, it breeds only tragedy. His story still speaks to us, centuries later, because it is not just about royalty. It is about anyone crushed under expectation, anyone forced to wear a mask that doesn't fit. We still live in a world that worships performance, where leaders pretend to be flawless, and those who break are discarded. Philip's madness exposes that lie. His life reminds us that greatness is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to face it. When the bells of Madrid rang for his death in July 1746, the sound rolled through the city like a storm leaving the horizon. For days afterward, the capital was silent. The courtiers whispered that the air felt lighter, the walls brighter. The people mourned their king, yet deep down, they understood the suffering had ended, both his and theirs. But the echo of those bells never really stopped. It lives in every throne, every leader, every person who carries the weight of expectation too heavy to bear. Philip V's death was not just the end of a life, it was the beginning of a reckoning, with power, with compassion, with the idea of what it means to lead. He proved that empires do not fall when kings go mad. They fall when compassion does. His tragedy became Spain's mirror, and ours. Behind every crown, there is a trembling hand. Behind every ruler, a frightened soul. And behind every history we tell of power, there is always, somewhere in the shadows, a human being simply trying to survive.